Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and today we are doing a review of the Erzetich Mania semi-open around-the-ear dynamic driver headphone from tiny Slovenian company Erzetich. Erzetich reached out to me back end of 2022 now, saying, "Hey, we like your style. Do you want to review some stuff for us?" And I said, "Sure." And this, along with their Perfidus headphone amp, came along a few weeks later. And I've had a good chance to listen to this now, and so we are going to dive into the review. So this and that amplifier I just mentioned are loans from Erzetich. I do not believe they are staying here. And other than answering some of my technical questions, Erzetich has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this piece in any way, so all thoughts that you are about to hear are mine and mine alone. So let's do shameless self-promotion as is our usual, and then we'll come back and we will get into the review. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Please remember to hit that like button, and if you haven't, please subscribe. Also, I have a Patreon set up so that you can help support me on a monthly basis, and I've set up a PayPal donation so that you can help me out in that way too if a monthly subscription does not make sense for you. Links for all of that, including the benefits, in the description below. Please check those out. All right, on with the show. Erzetich lists the price of this headphone right now at 1,200 euro, which at the current exchange rate is just shy of 1,300 US dollars. It uses a titanium-coated dynamic driver in each cup there, and then it also is a semi-open design. It looks open back, but it leans a little bit more towards closed back in terms of the actual build and all of that. And like, you can kind of hear it from like when it's on your head in terms of its attenuating outside sounds, and then if you ever hear it playing while it's on a headphone stand or something like that, like it does not leak as much as a true open back does. So that's part of it too. And I will link to a video that is on Erzetich's website in the description down below, which talks about some of the cup design and like why they made some of the design choices they made. Other than that, they have the drivers are rated at an 80 ohm impedance, but no efficiency measurement is given on the website. So what I'm going to do next then is jump to a kind of overhead vantage point where I talk more about the design and build of this. And I'll also just let the cat out of the bag here a little bit early on, that there are definitely some quirks and some oddities with this headphone. But by and large, it works. And I got several very enjoyable listening sessions in with this headphone. Like it takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think in a lot of ways it is worth it. And so we'll unpack all of that as we get in through the review here. So yeah, we'll go to that vantage point, and then I'll come back on the other side of this and we will talk about sound. Let's do the quasi-overhead shot to talk about the design and build of the Mania. And I usually don't use this vantage point when I talk about a headphone build. I just sit in front of the camera and hold it up for you. But there are enough interesting features about how this is designed and built that I wanted to give you a little bit closer view of, so you can see up close and personal what it's like. Now, this is also going to be somewhat of a running theme through this review. This headphone is very interesting. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know it, learn about it and its design quirks, and for the most part, with a couple of narrow exceptions, which we will talk to, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it as well. So yeah, let's do this different vantage point here to talk about some of those build quirks and all of that. So first thing here to notice, I mean, we have, there are several things to notice. I don't know if there is a first thing. I'll just kind of move it around for you and just give you a look at it, okay? The build is completely symmetric, okay? There are no labels for right or left on it or anything. Okay, the pads are pretty much, they're round basically and very close to identical. There's just a little bit of change in shape with manufacturing variants and all of that, but basically they're the same thing on either side. All that, so because there are no right or left labels, like you can plug this in to right or left of your headphone cable however you want. You can put it this way on your head with your right ear over here and your left ear over here, or you can completely flip it around and do it this way, and it really doesn't change anything. Okay, it's really fascinating that they took that approach. Why is that interesting right off the bat? Well, it is very common for headphone makers these days to create an angle between the plane of the side of your head and then the plane that the headphone driver sits in. So let's just say that this hand here, my left hand, is just a plane of the side of your head. Many headphone manufacturers build their headphones to position the driver something like this, okay, creating an angle right there between the plane of the side of your head and the plane of the driver. Erzetich is doing this, okay? The two planes are parallel. Okay, what do I mean by that? Like here's the Hi-Fiman HE1000 SE. The pads are thicker in the back than they are in the front, which you can really see in a view like this. So I'm going to exaggerate it here. When they're on your head, there's an angle between the plane of the side of your head and the plane of the driver's, okay? So a lot of makers use pad design to do that angling thing. Hi-Fiman, Odyssey, ZMF, let's see, Dan Clark, you know, a whole bunch of them. There's a whole slew of them these days. Use the pad design to do that. Another approach that is somewhat common is the focal approach, where the headphone itself here, like we have the same pad on either side. It's the same pad design, and let's see how well this will show. When you look inside the cup, okay, focus, camera, you will see that there's a little bit of a forward angle in how the driver is built in there too. So we're actually using, in this case, the housing itself to create that angle. Erzetich says, no, we're just going to go parallel. And you know what? It works. It does. And this is kind of the point I was making earlier on. There are some quirks and some different design and tuning choices that go into this thing that are unorthodox. They kind of buck some of the common trends going on in the headphone industry, but by and large it works. Okay, so I mean, and that's one of them. All right, other build aspects here is that each cup like has a lot of freedom of movement. Okay, and I mean a lot, and you turn it completely around like this and so forth. It is just a little bit splashy in the tensioning there, so I mean they will flop around on you a little bit, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but it also means that there's like no creaking. Okay, very little noise, right, in those emotions. All right, so they really use just the shape of your head to adjust, you know, this and this and all of that pretty well, okay? The head size adjustment here is not particularly big. Like there's not a ton of room right here on these rods. So I think people with, well, I just learned that. Looks like that. Pokes right back in. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Wow, not to panic. All right. Obviously, I didn't go that far, but people with large heads, I think, might have some comfort issues with these, because I usually keep headphones pretty close to the smallest size in their size adjustment. Like I usually like the headphones to sit a little bit higher up on my head, because that's what's most comfortable for me usually. So like on my Focal Radiance that I just showed you here on the size adjustment, like I'm pretty close to the smallest setting when I wear these. I might be like 1 or 2 notches in there. Likewise with the Heck SE here, you can see you can slide it all the way up, and I'm down like, what is that, a notch or 2 usually from the smallest size when I do that. So this right here is probably a little bit bigger adjustment than I usually use for headphones. So I think people with larger heads may have a little bit of comfort issues with these beyond the norm. Okay. Other than that, the construction here is we have aluminum, CNC'd aluminum here on the back of the cup, right here on the, what's this called? Is this the gimbal, I think? Something like that. And then we have linden wood, which is handmade, and you can kind of see that the tooling marks are not completely symmetric. Now that doesn't bother me. They are hand built. So we can expect a little bit of difference there. And I still think it looks nice, and that the uniqueness of, like, each piece is going to be unique in those tooling marks. And I think that's cool. You're free to say, hey, that's a crappy build. It's not crappy build. Okay, these are fairly well built. It's just there's going to be some uniqueness there in those tooling marks. And then we have these, I think the term used on the website was leatherette pads. Now, they specify on the website that there were no animal products used in the making of this. So this is not real leather. This is a faux leather, but it feels very convincing. Okay, it feels nice. It's soft. The pads have some cushiness to them and all of that. There's somewhat reasonable ear size openings here. The bottom of the pads can push on the bottom of my earlobes a little bit. And after about 2 hours or so, that's when I start to notice that. So it takes a while for that to become uncomfortable for me. You may be different. And then we do have a suspension strap style headband here with carbon fiber right here. And then this is a kind of a rubbery material here up top there. And the clamp is not, it's just kind of middling. It's not super tight. It's not super loose. It did a good job of keeping these on my head without them sliding around. But also, again, I found that I was able to wear these up until about 2 hours before I had any kind of comfort issues. And usually that was not because of the headband. That was because, again, the lower part of the pad pushing on the lower part of my earlobe. Okay, that's the build of the headphone. You see that we have the dual entry 4-pin mini XLR, which is compatible with any cables that will work with Audeze, ZMF, Meze. That's good, because here is the stock cable for this piece here, for this headphone. Right, and this particular one came with a 1/4 inch 6.35 millimeter single-ended termination on the amp end. And then we see the dual 4-pin mini XLR here on the headphone and all of that. And we have like this clear vinyl coating over the conductor here after, there's a name for this, I forget what it is, but after the split there, and then it's nylon coated after that. Okay, and I just have to be straight up honest here. To me, the biggest letdown of the entire package with this Mania headphone has been this cable. I don't really like this cable. For one thing, it's a bit of an ergonomic headache. It's just too thick. It's got too much memory. Let's see if this will do it. Let me move this out of the way, because one thing I observed once is when I went and I coiled this thing up, okay, and then I just set it down. See if it'll do it. Yeah, it did it. That's just too much. It's too springy, all that. And then there are some sonic problems with this, which I will get to in the sound portion. So I think, so again, like I, for the most part, really like this headphone. I did not like this cable. So if you were to buy this, I would really strongly recommend a different cable. The one that I ended up using, I have right here, all coiled up, so you can see it doesn't spring and unwind everywhere. This is my Forza Audio Works Noir Hybrid HPC cable. One reason I use it is because it comes with the XLR termination. The other reason is you just see it's much, much more ergonomically friendly. Okay, it lays much nicer on the desk. You can coil it up and all of that. It has much less memory. And if you're concerned about the price difference of the cable, I looked this up. I think these are about 200 euro, close to 250 US dollar right now, because Forza is an EU-based company. If you were to buy the 4-pin XLR version of the stock cable separately, okay, they charge you 200 euros for it. I mean, 199, but sure, 200 euros for it, which is about the same price. So the cable here is the biggest disappointment. I'm not going to dwell on it any further. I just think I really like the headphone, really dislike the cable. Okay. So I think I covered a lot of the interesting little design and build quirks of this headphone. Let's get into the sound. Before we truly jump into the sound, I do want to come back to the point, because you saw that in the video that I just made, that you can completely slide the cup out from the headband like that. And honestly, I think that is intentional, because Erzetich talks up on their website that this thing is completely serviceable, and you can see that it is. I'm pretty sure that is an intentional design thing that I just didn't get around to, because I didn't need to extend the headband out that far. But you can see that that is an intentional thing, and it's really easy to do. And so if ever you need to service this thing or replace the headband or anything like that, it's pretty easy to do. Okay, more kind of a modular construction in that way. So I thought it was fair to come back and hit that point and show that there too. And so that hopefully my surprise in that video is not taken the wrong way, and that everyone sees this little clip too. All right. So, sound. The gear that I tested this on, let's see. The source gear was mostly digital files, lossless files, either from local files or streamed from Qobuz. And most of that would have been through, I'm a new Rune user, so I have a little NUC computer set up running the Rock operating system, and I'm working on a review of the iFi Neo Stream, and I was using that as a Rune endpoint. And in the stream, I'm using SPDIF coax output into my Berkeley Audio Alpha Series 2. And then, let's see, other DACs that I tried. I think I2S from the Neo Stream is going into the, yes, this is correct. I2S is going into the SMSL VMV D1SE DAC, which is in for review. And then the AES output of the Neo Stream is going into the Musician Draco DAC, which I am working on a review for. So those are two mid-fi DACs that I used. For amps, I used my Berkeley Alpha, that's a DAC, sorry, I just said that. For amps, I'm using my Vielectric HPA V281 as kind of the big guy there to really see how this scales up. And then I also used my Lake People G111 Mark II some. I used Erzetich's own Perfitus headphone amp a lot, and I'm working on a review for that too, so that will be coming out very soon. And let's see, I tried, because of the 80 ohm impedance on these drivers, it made sense to try it on my KN HA1A Mark II tube amp set on its lowest output impedance setting. And then I also tried my Chord Hugo 2 a bit as a transportable DAC amp driving this. Okay. I did use the stock cable some until I learned what was going on with it sonically, and then I switched to pretty much exclusively using that Forza Noir Hybrid HPC cable that I mentioned earlier. All right, so then on to the sound proper then of the Mania headphone, and let me just stick it on my head here for a little bit. It's unorthodox. It's tuned a little bit differently than most of the world of headphones are right now. And I realize that headphones vary a lot in their tuning. This one is more unorthodox than most to my ear. The tuning, it leans a little bit dark. Okay, it's not super bassy, but it's like, it goes a little bit past, like the emphasis is a little bit lower than the warmth range, and it's more into the dark territory. That said, it is still also fairly well balanced throughout the entire frequency spectrum. So it just leans into the dark tuning a little bit. It doesn't go full bore into it. So there's still fairly good mid presence, and there's still fairly good treble presence. But again, the overall tuning is just a little bit more towards the dark and slightly rich side of things on that, which is not super common these days, at least not from what I've heard. Okay. The tonality, though, and the overall tonal balance is very good, especially through the bass and the mid-range. The treble, it's not quite as strong in its tonality as it is in the bass or the mids. There is a little bit, there's a hint of peak going on in the consonant range. So there is a little bit of sibilance that happens every now and then. Not a whole lot of added, but it kind of hints at it. Even if it doesn't go fully sharp or sibilant, it hints at it just a little bit. So very mild peak in the consonant range, just a little bit, but not horrible. Okay, so the tuning and tonality, a little bit dark and rich, a little bit unorthodox, and all that, but still fairly well balanced with good balance between like fundamentals and harmonic frequencies and all of that through most of the frequency range, especially the bass and the mid-range, I think. Okay. That treble peak we'll unpack a little bit more because that to me is where the most interesting, let's call it negative, aspect of the sound happens. So this headphone with that treble peak is very signal chain sensitive. The amount of forwardness of that treble peak, the amount of sibilance that would show up, and the sharpness and sort of like this thinness to the timbre in the treble varied quite a bit with signal chain. Okay, and that, yes, this is true. I know some of you are going to hate this, but that also includes this stock cable on that. So the problem with this stock cable sonically that I mentioned, you saw the ergonomic and build quirks with it earlier, but sonically, it makes that treble peak and treble brittleness in there much more noticeable. Lots of really sharp S's, T's, and that sort of thing. Really harsh, sharp, like hi-hat hits, cymbal hits, that sort of thing. Just the treble takes on a very aggressive and thin metallic-y, and not in the way that cymbals are metallic, but like not good metallic-y kind of sound. Also, this cable does not, it hurts the spatial presentation a little bit. Left, center, and left, right are not as fully fleshed out in the soundstage as they are with as the headphone is with my Forza cable that I've been talking about. So that is one way in which this headphone is signal chain sensitive. Okay, and again, I would, if you're going to buy this headphone, which I think the headphone really will appeal to a certain audience, which we'll get to in a bit, I would really get an aftermarket cable. Like, very strongly recommend that. Okay, all right. The other way in which this is signal chain sensitive is that that treble peak that I'm talking about in there would come forward or recede a little bit depending on DAC, depending on amp, and so forth. Like my Berkeley made this a little bit brighter overall in its sound, but it also controlled that treble peak probably the best of any of the DACs that I have, which it should. It's the most expensive one. Surprisingly, my Hugo 2 as a DAC and amp together did not agree with this headphone very well. That treble peak came back, even with the Forza cable, came back fairly aggressively and was not a very pleasant listen, unfortunately. The SMSL and Musician DACs that I mentioned did a pretty good job, especially from their balanced outputs, but the Musician Draco in particular from its single-ended output, that treble peak came back in a very harsh way on this as well. And then of the amps that I use, well, I should say that might be more of an issue with the Musician Draco. Again, I'm working on a review for that. It's not rare for a mid-fi DAC that is balanced to not be so great from its single-ended output, and that might be what I'm hearing through the Erzetich here, through the Mania as well. So I'll have to come back and unpack that. But all I know is that the treble peak that exists in here becomes a lot more harsh and fatiguing from the single-ended output of that Draco DAC than it did on any of the other DACs, save maybe the Hugo 2. Through this thing. Of the amps that I used, the Perfitus from Erzetich matched this very well, which shouldn't surprise no one. I thought that was a really good match. The V281 sounded really good with this. The G111 Mark II sounded really good with this. The K and HA1A Mark II tube amp, mostly okay, but that treble was just a little bit too much for me at times, a little bit. So that came out there too. So you do need to put some care into signal change with this. So it's another one of the quirks of this headphone that you should be aware of, okay, if you're going to buy it. All right. Now that we've got all of the sort of nastiness and unpleasantness out of the way, let's get to what it does well, because that list is significant. All right. Let's start with that treble again. The treble is not forward, other than that peak sometimes on some gear. The treble is not forward. It does sound just a little bit tonally thin in comparison to the mids and the bass. So it's really not a treble focused headphone, and it's not going to like strike you with its wonderful, phenomenal treble timbre. But when you get that peak under control, it sounds pretty good in there with lots of detail. Pretty good like trailing tones and decays on, like when you hit a cymbal and you just let it do its natural decay and all of that. This picks that out pretty well. Sounds pretty good. I especially thought that within the treble, like the bell shots on cymbals sounded pretty good through this thing. But the treble is the overall relative weakness of the sound, because the bass and the mids are really where it's at with this one. So starting with the bass is a little bit present. It's a little bit elevated, not hugely so. It has decent extension, but not like necessarily class leading extension, but it does get down there pretty deep and all of that. What really stood out to me about the bass was how amazingly detailed and textured it is for a headphone at this price point. This has some of the best bass detail and texturing that I have heard from a headphone that is under $1,500. I was routinely impressed by how well it resolved and picked out every note of a bass guitar pluck with good texturing and all of that, routinely and across different kinds of recordings. That is really well done here. And it does it with a fair amount of impact. It's not like a real hard hitter, not a whole lot of punch slam, at least not on like a Focal or a Foztex kind of level. It probably hits like sort of around the range of, like, if you're familiar with how Odyssey's hit and Hi-Fi Man's hit, it's kind of in between those two. A little bit harder than the Hi-Fi Man, not quite as hard as the Odyssey, just kind of in between in there. Okay, so decent, not necessarily a strength, definitely not a weakness in terms of that dynamics and physicality, particularly in the low end. The mid-range here, some people are going to perceive the mid-range as being recessed. I don't agree with that take, at least my ears don't hear it that way. I do think the mids have very good tonal balance to them and come across with giving a pretty good timbre. Combining the tonal balance with appropriate attack and decay, you get pretty good mid timbre here. So voices sound very lifelike for the type of headphone and at the price point. I routinely thought that vocals, both male and female, sounded pretty good through here. Again, not forward. They're not going to stand out from the mix or from the sound stage like other competitors have done by pushing either the 1K or the 3K range forward. So they're not going to stand out. They will be organically part of the presentation, but there's a lot of good clarity and timbre to vocals. And then that extends to a lot of mid-range instruments like guitars, pianos, drums, stringed instruments, like those kinds of things, all sounding pretty good and natural in timbre. And then there's also pretty good resolution still through the mids too, like things like room reverbs and ghost notes on drums, and like the finger action that you hear on guitars, like bass guitars, regular guitars, all of that, like all come through pretty clearly on this too. All right. So then getting into spatial presentation. So again, it leans more in its design of the cup. It leans more towards a closed back than an open. So it's a semi-open, kind of leaning more towards closed. So You're not going to get a huge expansive soundstage, but it's reasonably big in its sound staging. But again, it's not, you know, it's not going to be like hi-fi size, not anything close to like that. Okay, but probably about, if you're familiar with like how a lot of Odysseys stage, I'd say it's probably around that size. Okay, in a lot of ways there. Imaging and separation, pretty good. You get a fairly decent sense of, like, especially laterally, where things are with a reasonable amount of separation and space in between. Not a ton of depth, that's common at this price, but a little bit. So I would say the spatial aspects here, the imaging and the separation, all that, creating a 3D sound field is not outstanding, but it's also not poor. This headphone too. So when we sum that up, all those traits up, like, what kind of music is this headphone really for, and who do I think should be interested in it? Let's just do the music thing first. Then we'll talk some comparisons, and then we'll come back to who I think should be interested or will be interested in this headphone. This is a good headphone because when you get that treble peak under control with the proper signal chain, because the treble is a bit more laid back, okay, and it's very non-fatiguing in the treble. This is really a good hard rock, heavy metal, classic rock kind of headphone. It may not be quite bassy or punchy enough for some on hip hop and R&B, but it will also be bassy and punchy enough for many listeners on those genres too. You can do all right with jazz music and some vocal music and some classical music because the mid-range timbre is strong. If you need spatial presentation, particularly with like large symphonies and all of that, to feel like you are there with some classical music, I don't think the spatial presentation is quite as strong as it needs to be to pull that off. Okay, but like string quartets and that sort of thing, I think the timbre and the tuning will work for some on that sound as well. But if you're a treble-sensitive listener and you're willing to tweak a signal chain to get this thing's treble peak under control, and you like hard rock, heavy metal, those kinds of things, okay, give this one some serious thought. All right, let's talk about some comparisons then with some similarly priced units. So at $1,300 USD, this lands comfortably in the range of like the $1,200 to $1,800 headphone, open back headphone, or even closed territory that is just very crowded right now. So I'm not going to be able to compare this headphone to every other model in that range, other than to give some general thoughts. I think that the bass resolution and texturing in particular, this is very close to, if not, I mean, it's way up there in that price category in terms of how well it does that. That is a true strength of this headphone. It's well done to Erzetich on that particular feature. Okay, very good. The mid-range timbre, I'm going to say, is probably a little bit above average. It's not quite as rich or as accurate as something that you'll get from like Sennheiser, not quite as good as something you'll get from Hi-Fi Man in terms of that, but I would put it ahead of the Focal Clear. I would put it ahead of the Odyssey LCDX or the Odyssey MM500, okay, and so forth on like vocal timbre and sounding natural through the mids, even though the mids, some are going to perceive as a little bit more recessed. The quality of the mids here, I think, is above average for the price point. Where it's going to be a little bit below average then is in the treble timbre. Not quite as strong as many others there in that price range there. And then its spatial presentation is probably also kind of in the middling range there as well. Kind of mid-size soundstage, kind of mid-range in terms of its ability to do imaging, separation, that sort of thing. And I think the dynamics, the impact, the punch of it is probably pretty close to middle of the road in that pack in there too. All right, so wrapping all of that up, again, I enjoyed, once I got the signal chain stuff figured out, and once I got the cable issue, I threw the cable down over there. Once I got the cable issue and all of that figured out, and kind of got a feel for what this thing was doing. I got several multi-hour listening sessions in there, which were very non-fatiguing, with a lot of hard rock, heavy metal, kinds of music that I like. Really enjoyable. It does a great job with those genres. So I will reiterate, if you are treble sensitive and willing to work to get the signal chain to get that treble peak under control, you can give these some thought, because they are really good for that genre. Create a non-fatiguing sound there. They are comfortable enough for me that I could get at least 2 hours into them before I started to get any kind of comfort issues, and even at that, they were usually mild and built slowly, and I could keep mostly enjoying the music from that point on. All right. We'll leave it there then. I am Wave Theory. This has been my review of the Erzetich Mania headphone. Please check out my PayPal, where you can make a one-time donation to help support this channel. Please check out my Patreon, where you can be a monthly subscriber and support me that way, and then also get into a Discord where you get to talk to me. Links to both of those things are down in the description. Otherwise, if you have not subscribed to my channel yet, please do that, and please leave a like on this video, leave a comment, tell me what you think about the video, what you think of the Erzetich Mania, any of those things. And as usual, I'm Wave Theory. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the music.